How is everybody doing tonight? It's so good to see all of you here. Thank you for coming. Does it feel like snow out there to anybody else? Feels like it's getting close, doesn't it? Especially if you don't have enough hair up on top, you really can tell when that stuff is getting cold. But good to see all of you here tonight. Thanks for coming. I mean, you've been so faithful. I mean, this has been a long series. Last week, Kirk rightly said it was a little like taking a drink out of a fire hydrant last week. And it's not because I'm trying to cram too much information. I'm just trying to get through one chapter. The book of Revelation, there's so much about it. And just about every phrase, every verse, sometimes every word is a prophetic. There's a message that's being trying to communicate it through this very old book. And so anyway, I don't really, it's not my intention to cram too much in, but it's also not my intention to be in this series for another year. So we're getting towards the end. We're in chapter 17 tonight. And I want to just clean up, if I could bat up a couple of things, because I got to the end of last week and then just threw Armageddon at you in like the last 5 minutes. And so I wanted to see maybe we back up and if you had any more questions about that. So just to review, a Jewish apocalypse, which is what this is. I'm really taking myself almost every week. I really wanted to name this series, and if I ever write a book, which I don't know if I ever will, but if I do, it will be called The Apocalypse of Jesus. And I was a little worried that people wouldn't come, because when people think of an apocalypse, they think of the end of the world. And it sounds a little scary to think of the apocalypse of Jesus, but an apocalypse is it's a prophetic work. It's a prophetic work of literature. I don't mean to say that like it's only poetry or it's only literature. It's prophetic literature. But we have in the Bible, we have prophetic narratives like Jonah. It's not just a story, it's a prophetic story. You know, when you read through it, you go, oh, wow, and you have spiritual meaning. It's because that's the way it was written. Jonah is a sermon, right? Written in the form of a story. Sometimes the prophets wrote in poetry. I believe that all of the Psalms are prophetic. Sometimes they wrote in prose where they just spoke. Sometimes they wrote in oracles. And then sometimes they wrote in apocalypses. And that's the least understood and the least known. In most Bible classes, you'll say, oh, there's a history section and a poetry section. I don't think there's any history section. I think the whole thing should be in the prophecy section. But there's prophetic narratives, there's prophetic poetry, and there's an apocalypse. How do you know it's an apocalypse? Have you been here long enough to just off the top of your head? What's 2 or 3 things that identify it as an apocalypse when you're reading it in the Bible and all of a sudden? Oh yeah, it starts with a visitation from an angel, or some heavenly emissary, or a man of God, or a son of God. So sometimes that is talking about the Messiah, it's talking about Jesus. Sometimes that's another way of saying just some kind of a spiritual person or spiritual being. So first thing is you get visited by an angelic messenger. What's another? There's time travel. Yeah, you have to wrap your brain around, and tonight is no exception. Everything in an apocalypse happens in a dream. And so inside of dreams, time and space you're not bound by time and space. So you can time travel. That's one of the major reasons, by the way, which chapter 17 gets misinterpreted by 95% of people that read it, including scholars and professors and pastors. And because they don't understand the relation of the prophecy to time. Somebody else? How do you know it's an apocalypse when you start reading it in the Bible? It's dreamlike? Yeah. I hate to say it like this, but it's a little bit weird. It's okay to say that. It's meant to be. It's dreamlike and weird, and it uses symbolism. And by the way, here's another telltale sign that you're in an apocalypse. It's a little bit difficult to understand. So if you've ever read through the book of Revelation and say, man, I don't understand a lot of what's going on in this, it's not your fault. You don't need to adjust your television set. That's the way it was written. It was written to be a puzzle. If you breezed through Revelation the first time and understood everything that was saying, you did not read it right. It's supposed to be confusing and weird. That's the style. It's like listening to jazz and saying, how come they play so many weird notes? Yeah. Was that on accident? No. They did it on purpose. Well, at least they tell us they did it on purpose. I think what they do is if they play a wrong note, they just play it twice. And then it makes it sound like it was on purpose, right? But jazz is supposed to sound like that. An apocalypse is supposed to sound like an apocalypse. And so it's a prophetic work of symbolic art giving spiritual meaning and encouragement to a traumatized generation. And this is one of the biggest things that people miss about the apocalypse of John, is that it was written to a generation that had been traumatized. And so then to assume that everything in it pertains to something happening 2,000 years in the future, then it means nothing to that first generation, because they all lived and died without any of it coming true. But so in this series, I've been kind of just trying to unpack what it would have meant to that generation. And that generation, we need to understand what was their trauma. And the biggest trauma of their generation was the destruction of Jerusalem, and eventually the ending of the Old Testament Judaism and the birth of Christianity, the birth of the early church and rabbinic Judaism. Judaism isn't dead, but there's no longer a temple. There's no longer, the promised land has been restored, but that happened because of a bunch of other things in the 20th century. But there's no more priesthood and there's no more sacrifices. All of those things were a part of their identity, and they're all over. I have this chart. My buddy Kenny, howdy Kenny, I always got to say hi to him, because he tells me after I told everybody they should memorize this chart, he screenshot it and he's trying to memorize it. You don't have to, I'll remind it of, but there's only 5. I know there's several categories, but there's only 5. Most of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible should be read in the context of one of these 5 traumas. And so if you're not familiar with those historical traumas, I'll just do them really. The first one happened in the 8th century, about 722 BC. And by the way, that date, it also involves events on several years on either side. But the final destruction of the capital of Samaria, of the northern kingdom of Israel, happened around 722 AD. And I'm going to show you something that was a serious part of it. Tel Megiddo, the mountain of Megiddo, was a central part of that destruction, because Megiddo was one of the ancient capitals of the northern kingdom of Syria. And so Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, these are prophets that they weren't full-blown apocalypses, but there are apocalyptic sections of those books. The second one was now the southern kingdom. Now all the northerners, not all of them, they flooded south, and the kingdom of Judah became prominent in Jerusalem. It survived the destruction of the Assyrians, but it did not survive the Babylonians. So you're going to hear in the next 3 chapters a lot use the word Babylon. And if you just read it like I did when I was a little kid, I'm like, what's a Babylon? I have no idea what that is. And so this is why, to understand the book of Revelation, you have to at least basically understand what Babylon is and what significance it had to these people. And so the Babylonians were the empire that conquered the Assyrians. So these were both people groups in the area of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. So the Babylonians were the empire that conquered the Assyrians. And so for a while, Judah and Jerusalem, they were vassal kingdoms of Babylon, and eventually they stopped paying their taxes, or they called them tributes. It was like being a part of the mafia, right? And they stopped kicking up to the mafia heads, and what would happen is they would come in and destroy you. So Nebuchadnezzar II came in 587, but finally in 586 BC, and destroyed the first temple. So there's going to be some prophecies about that's going to show up in the book of Revelation tonight. There's language from all of these traumas that shows up, because the final destruction of Jerusalem was like a reliving of all of that. The third one was when the Persians rose up and conquered the Babylonians. Sorry, Kenny, I just changed column number 3, because rather than saying the end of the exile, I'm going to say Babylon destroyed. And so now, from the perspective of somebody, Babylon is destroyed and now we're exiled into Babylon. Not everybody was, but some were riding from Babylon. And then Persia conquers them and now they come back. Coming out of Babylon is what chapter 19 of Revelation is all about. Only in that chapter, coming out of Babylon means coming out of Jerusalem. So the church now is reliving what their ancient ancestors did when Babylon was destroyed and then they came out, right? And so the destruction of Babylon is that. The destruction of Babylon for the next 3 chapters in Revelation is going to become a metaphor for the destruction of Jerusalem. And in the same way that they had to get out of Babylon, now the early church had to get out of Jerusalem. The fourth one is when the Greeks were in charge and they desecrated the temple. There's not a lot from that layer, but there is in some parts of Revelation. And then the last one is the Romans that destroyed the second temple in 70 AD, and it launched the early church. Already, many of the Christians that were in the town had fled to Asia Minor, had fled to Egypt, had fled to Mesopotamia. The Christian diaspora, we call it, the dispersion, was in full swing. When the Apostle Paul went around on his missionary journeys, he would always start in the synagogues. And so this book was written to Christians who had been dispersed after Jerusalem was destroyed. And the core identity that they had attached to that Old Testament religion was ended. And so it's an apocalypse to lament the end of an age, but also talk about what a new opportunity it was, and now how we were new in Christ and Jesus was on his throne. Yeah? Follow me on that? Any questions? All right. So we ended here, and he gathered them together into the place which is in Hebrew called Har Megiddo. So, Har Megiddo is a place. I said this last week. When have you ever heard that said? When they talk about the movie Armageddon, they're not talking about a place, they're talking about a meteorite coming and destroying the whole world, right? Armageddon for most people means the end of the world. Armageddon in the Bible, and this is the only place where that phrase is used together. Megiddo is mentioned in the Bible. It's a city, but it's also a plain. And I read one of my favorite commentaries, brilliant scholarly commentary, and said, well, it says this, but this is a mistranslation in King James because Megiddo is a plain, not a city. And I said, how can you say that it's so wrong? Because we have a picture of it. I'll show it to you in just a minute. So today, if you look at it in Google Maps, it's called Tel Megiddo. Har means mountain in Hebrew. A tel is an archaeological feature. It's a small hill that's not a natural hill. It's only a mountain or a hill because there have been dozens and dozens of mounts of cities built over the top of each other. The earliest archaeology that they have from Tel Megiddo is from about 3500 BC. We have letters in the 14th century written by the Pharaoh of Egypt to the king of Megiddo, of when the Akkadians took it over. We have it in every language. This is one of the oldest cities in the Levant, in the Holy Land. And one of the most scientifically advanced, I mean that they had technologically advanced cities. They were really important. And so, why don't I have, this is going to come out of order. And so it was the capital of the northern kingdom under the Omrides, 9th century, 8th century, until the Assyrians under Tiglath-Pileser came. Yeah, great, make them out of order. And he took it. So the Omride dynasty, prominent king was Jeroboam II in the Old Testament. In 722, Sargon II, who was a subsequent ruler of Assyria, he came in and made it his administrative center. And so under his leadership, they constructed new gates and 2 new palaces. We have the archaeology of these. They created a crisscross pattern for the streets. And then in 609, Pharaoh Necho II, who's mentioned in the Bible, came up to fight against the Assyrians because they were the two world powers. And somehow, wise and righteous King Josiah did something very foolish. He went out to go and head them off. Why he didn't just let him go fight the Assyrians, nobody knows. But he went out, and that's where King Josiah was killed. And that was about 609. In 586, now the Babylonians came in and conquered both kingdoms and didn't rebuild the city of Megiddo. In fact, we don't know if anybody ever did after that. It was destroyed. There's one archaeologist I found that thinks that about 350 BC, it was still inhabited, but by and large, it was abandoned after this. And so it's right up here. Here's Mount Tabor, and here's Mount Megiddo. There's Mount Carmel right there. This is in the northern section. That's the Sea of Galilee. Syria is up here. Lebanon is up here. And Megiddo is right there. So there's an important road that goes from here. It's called the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea. And there's another highway from over on this side of the Jordan called the King's Highway. So you know what Megiddo is? It's the crossroads of northern Israel. It's right in the crosshairs. And so it was one of the most strategic places. It looks like this. This is actually after they've excavated. Kevin said, I wish you could zoom in on it, but this isn't a Megiddo class. We'll get there when we, if you go to Israel with me, we'll do a whole night on it maybe. But over here is the palaces. There's some horse stables. I don't know if you can see it, but right up here in the corner, you can see Mount Tabor. That's how small this is. So that's the story of Barak and Deborah when they came down here, and then Sisera and his men got trapped in the swamp right around Megiddo. And so this is an ancient city, but here's the whole point of this. In the first century, when Revelation was being written, Megiddo was an ancient ruins. Megiddo had never been inhabited after that. They built little towns around it. And this, by the way, I'm saying it like I know. I read a lot and listen to a lot of my favorite archaeologist, Israel Finkelstein. Isn't that a great name? He's a prominent modern archaeologist. And he says one of the beautiful things about this site is that it, unlike a lot of the cities in Israel that got built over and a lot of the ruins got ruined, they got destroyed or removed, when they dug down into this place, it's one of the best preserved ancient cities. And so you can go all the way down to material culture of what was happening way back in those days. This is Megiddo. It's a place. So when John is writing the book of Revelation, and he says, and then they all gathered together in the place in Hebrew, it's called Har Megiddo. He wasn't talking about this literal place. He was using the destruction of this ancient capital as a metaphor for the destruction of Jerusalem. All right? Where is Har Megiddo? Har Megiddo is Jerusalem. He's saying they all gathered together, and I'm going to give it the nickname Har Megiddo. In another verse, he calls it Sodom and Gomorrah. In another verse, he calls it Egypt. In another verse, he calls it Babylon. What do these all have in common? These are the ancient capitals that were destroyed that they needed to get out of. And so, just as Megiddo is abandoned, now Jerusalem's going to be abandoned. Just as the ancient capital of the north was destroyed, left in ruins, that after the Romans are done with it, Jerusalem is going to be an ancient ruined capital. Just as Babylon, also a ruins in the first century, just as Babylon used to be the greatest city in the world and now it's a ruins, that's what Jerusalem's going to be. So tonight I want to talk about, and for the next couple of weeks as well, my best understanding of what Babylon is in the book of Revelation is not popular. And that's not because it's wrong. There's a whole historical reason why the majority of people, when they say, what is Babylon in the book of Revelation? They say it's Rome. Because they're looking at it from a perspective that we are Israel, and who was our enemy? It was Rome. And I'll just show it to you on the page and say why I believe that Babylon the Great is Jerusalem. Because Babylon the Great is what was destroyed in the first century. Are you with me? Rome was not destroyed until 400 years, until 400 AD. by the Goths and the Visigoths, and by that time Rome was Christian. So it doesn't make sense for Babylon to be Rome in the book of Revelation. But so let me just read the rest of this. And then the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a voice came out of the temple of heaven saying, "It is done." And there were lightnings and sounds and thunders, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were on earth. So great an earthquake, so mighty. The great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great, that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Babylon the Great was remembered in the sight of God, to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. Great hailstones about the weight of a talent came down out of the sky on people. People blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, and this plague is exceedingly severe. There was a plague of hail also in Egypt, so this is another one of those Egyptian plagues that's coming back as a metaphor. But all of these earthquakes and destruction and stuff, these are all like signs in the heavens that are kind of the emotional impact of what it meant for the capital of Jerusalem to be destroyed for that generation. And so this is what an apocalypse is it uses big pictures and symbols and things like that to talk about something that was so traumatic that it changed the entire generation forever. Never left them the same. I talked a little bit, if you weren't here last week, about the effect of trauma on people and how we deal with trauma. And part of what an apocalypse is written to do is to not only express, but to explain the purpose behind the trauma they just went through. Here's the purpose of it, is now it's time for the church to step up and be the church. It's no longer about a temple, now the temple's here. It's no longer about a priest in Jerusalem, now our priest is in heaven. And so the whole mindset and orientation changed. Any questions about Armageddon before I go on? You guys always ask great questions after the cameras stop rolling. Tonight I want to talk about the great harlot. And I went really back and forth on what actually to call her. But it just introduces her in Revelation chapter 17. And it says this, one of the 7 angels who had 7 bowls came out and spoke with me, saying, so here's the first thing, Charlie. One of the angels who had the bowls full of the wrath, which was the prayers of the saints poured out. So this is God's vindication of his people. Everything you're about to hear is out of the mouth of one of those angels. Right? This is not a videotape. This is not a DVR. It's not a video you took on your phone. This is a vision explained by an angel. And so he says, come here and I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the land committed adultery, and those who dwell in the land were made drunken with the wine of her adultery. All of these phrases are meant on purpose. I said I went back and forth to call her. I called her the great harlot tonight. I used an old-timey word because it's a little less offensive. When you look at it on Wikipedia, she's called the whore of Babylon. Just not a word we typically get by with using about women, even if that's what they do for a living. We don't use that word anymore, right? Somehow it's a very offensive word, and it's right there in the Bible. We don't mind calling her the whore of Babylon. I don't know if we would give her a little politically correct update today, if we'd call her the sex worker from Mesopotamia, or we'd call her the hooker from Baghdad, or what we would call her. But anything that I say or any way that I phrase it that's not offensive does not quite communicate this word picture. Are you with me? And let me just tell you, this is not about a woman. Okay? I'm going to tell you the end of my math and explain to you why I believe the great harlot is not Rome. The great harlot is Jerusalem. The great harlot is the same thing as Babylon the Great. They're the same thing. In one, she's a city. In the other, she's a great harlot. And where do I get that? First of all, it's all over the Hebrew Bible. I honestly can't, let me just stop and say this. I already told you, didn't I, that my opinion is a minority opinion. I don't know if you were to line 100 pastors or Bible professors up, out of 100 of them, you might get 5 to 10 of them that believe that Jerusalem is the harlot, not Rome. And there's a historical reason for that. Many of the early church fathers were futurist, and by that time they were being persecuted by Rome, and so it made sense that the one that's going to be destroyed is Rome. If you're thinking about a future destruction, then who else could it have been for them but Rome? So I'm making the case that this wasn't a prediction, it was a post-diction. In the apocalypse, he was traveling back and talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So if it's not a future prediction, if it was a past prediction, it was a post-diction, then it's Jerusalem, and it makes sense. But that got disintegrated, and then Rome became Christian. There's a whole long saga about how these theories developed. And then it couldn't be Rome, obviously, because Rome is now Christian. And then Rome got sacked, and so Augustine said, well, it must be a spiritual kingdom. And that was the default for most of church history until the Reformation happened in the 16th century. And the New Protestant says, oh, that's easy. We know who the prostitute is. It's the Roman Catholic Church. That's Babylon. I mean, what else? Look at those Catholics and their priests, and it's just like they're committing prostitution because it's a false religion. Try to pry that out of the mouth of one of the reformers. I dare you. It was impossible. And so there was a minority opinion. Some of the Catholic anti-Reformationists went back, started reading it for what it was really saying, and said, wait, it says it right there that Babylon is the city where their Lord was killed. That comes in a couple chapters. Of course that's Jerusalem. And it got rejected by most Protestants because it was the Catholic view, and the Catholics were just trying to defend themselves and saying, we are not the prostitute. All right? Since then, it's used as a derogatory term for any religion you don't agree with. They're the whore of Babylon. They're the whore. I said I wasn't going to use the word, but it comes out smoother that way, doesn't it? Just keep in mind, I'm not talking about a person, right? But that's the poetic phrase. And so for somebody like me, my problem is I don't really have a horse in the race. I really don't care which historical theories. I just want to know what the original was talking about. And so what I do, I set aside all of the opinions and don't listen, and I just go back and read the Bible. If you read the Old Testament prophets, you realize the idea of the prostitute in prophetic language is almost always about the people of God. How is that? The metaphor is this. Hosea is one of the first off the bat, one of the oldest books in the Bible. God says to me, go take for yourself a wife who's a prostitute. Why would you marry a prostitute? Can you imagine that? By the way, ladies, keep in mind, almost everything in the Bible was written by men, for men. Most women couldn't read, so it wasn't as offensive to them. And so how was Israel a prostitute? It's because they had the one God, and they were supposed to be following after Yahweh, but every time they had an opportunity, they created idols for themselves, and they worshiped the false gods of the other nations. So one of the first prophets in the Bible, Hosea, says, you want to know what it feels like to be the God of Israel? It's like being married to a prostitute who runs around with every guy in town. I'm humiliated everywhere I go. Everybody talks about me. It's just horrible. And so can you imagine that? So the metaphor for every guy, you say, I could not imagine being married to a woman. In fact, there's a part of it, I think it's in Ezekiel. He even takes the metaphor. Ezekiel takes the metaphor way too far. He's later on. But he even said, Israel, you're even worse than a prostitute because at least prostitutes get paid. You ran around after all those false gods for nothing. And so the idea of the great harlot in Revelation, it's talking about people that should be God's people, but they abandoned him and they went around chasing after other things. So I guess you could say, anytime those of us, we know the right, instead of following after the Lord, we put something else first. You could say, in the prophetic language, I wouldn't preach a message like this today, but in the prophetic language, they're saying that you're playing the harlot. Let me give you a few examples from the horse's mouth. Isaiah, which is very old. Remember, this is This is a prophecy about when the northern kingdom got attacked, and now Jerusalem got in on the act too. How the faithful city has become a prostitute. She was full of justice, righteousness lodged in her, but now murders. So she used to be a righteous city, but now she's a prostitute. In Jeremiah, which is during the exile, he says, won't the land be greatly polluted? You have played the prostitute with many lovers. You return again to me, yet return again to me, says Yahweh. All right, he's not talking about a woman. He's not talking about actual prostitution. He's using the sin of prostitution as a metaphor for how Israel was treating God. Are you with me? Just like a couple of chapters ago, the 144,000 who are virgins because they've never defiled themselves with women, that's a metaphor about idolatry too. That phrase has nothing to do with sexual relations. It's talking about symbolic idolatry. And so, how is a prostitute an adulteress? It's kind of confusing, right? Prostitute doesn't commit adultery. Prostitute does prostitution. But what he's saying is, yeah, because this prostitute is married. This prostitute is married to God. It's Jerusalem. And so, in most translations in the book of Revelation, they change one of those words because they say that the prostitute commits sexual immorality. Because it can't be adultery because it's a prostitute. They don't understand the Old Testament. That's exactly what it is. It's both. In Ezekiel 23, and by the way, he goes really off the deep end with this. She increased her prostitution, for she saw men portrayed on the wall in images of the Chaldeans portrayed with scarlet, girded with girdles on their waist, with flowing turbans on their neck, all of them princes to look on, after the likeness of the Babylonians in Chaldea in the land of their birth. This whole chapter, he talks about two sisters that are both prostitutes. And the northern one, I forget the names, Ulalala or something like that. I forget they're made up names, so I don't remember them. But the older sister is Samaria, capital of the northern kingdom, and the younger sister is Jerusalem. And he said, man, you thought the older sister was bad. You should see how bad the younger sister is. And you know, the older sister prostituted herself with Assyria. But the younger sister's prostituting herself with the Babylonians. And he's actually just saying it. So this prophecy is during when Babylon was the thing. And he's accusing Israel of committing prostitution with Babylon. Are you with me? It's not talking about an actual prostitute. It's talking about the people of God selling out to a foreign god, right? So who did that? That's about Jerusalem. It only makes sense if it's Jerusalem. How is Rome a prostitute? They're the ones that invaded. They were faithful to their gods. In fact, they think that's why they won. So how does it make sense that Rome is the prostitute? It just doesn't. Rome is the one that the prostitute is engaging with. You with me? So Jerusalem was prostituting herself out with Rome, having an adulterous relationship with Rome through the Herods and the. So anyway, it says in verse 3, I'm only through verse 3 right now, Revelation chapter 7, but I'm going to do good. He carried me away into the spirit, into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. So there's a lot about this. A couple of chapters ago, there was another woman that was carried into the wilderness by the Lord, being chased by the dragon. And I said that was the early church. She had 12 stars around her head, which was the 12 apostles. And she gave birth to a child. The dragon tried to kill the child. And that's a story about Satan or the devil trying to get at Jesus, but he's snatched up to heaven, and then the woman is carried off into the wilderness. This woman is the doppelganger of her. If you would, it's kind of like her evil twin. This is the other side, if you will, the other side of the coin of that faithful woman that was protected in the wilderness. And it's a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. That word is the same as in the previous couple of chapters, the beast out of the sea, which I went through great pains to talk about the number of the beast, which is, by the way, the most watched out of this whole series is the mark of the beast. So evidently my titles on YouTube do catch attention sometime. But the beast itself is Rome. It's Rome. Sometimes it sounds like it's one of the Roman emperors, but in general, it's the Roman Empire in general. It's the whole Roman Empire, sometimes as carried out by one of the Roman emperors. And sitting on a scarlet beast. And why scarlet? Scarlet, if you've ever seen, and I've shown you the Roman banners and the Roman costumes and stuff, that was a very big color representing the Roman army. And before I go on, we just mentioned the phrase "a woman sitting on a scarlet beast." So the woman is the prostitute, and she's sitting on top of this beast. We always see it in pictures as her riding, like a horse. There's more than a little bit of this. If it seems a little lewd or a little racy, there's more than a little bit that's inappropriate. I'll just leave it at that. And so not to belabor the point, but you say, that's really offensive. They couldn't put that in the Bible. The Bible is more rated R than you think it is. And so there really is, there's not kind of, he calls her a prostitute. So of course, there's a lot of this language that's very sexual, that's very offensive. It's supposed to be offensive. It's not a compliment, what he's calling them, right? Calling Jerusalem the great harlot is not a compliment. It's not soft. He's not soft pedaling it. He's saying there she was riding on the beast. And the beast is Rome. So this is talking about how far between the Herods, who were actually client kings of Rome, and the high priests, who were all appointed by Rome, and why the monks up at Qumran wouldn't even go visit the temple of Jerusalem because they considered it had sold out. The book of Revelation, to some extent, is talking, and these next 3 chapters are basically big, long songs about how badly Jerusalem had sold out. And he had 7 heads and 10 horns. We're going to get to those in a moment. We've already talked about those a little bit. 7 heads and 10 horns. He's actually going to explain those in this chapter. He doesn't explain a lot, but he's going to explain what the 7 heads and the 10 horns are. The 7 heads and the 10 horns represent Rome. The 7 heads are 7 different Roman emperors. I have my theory about which 7, but that doesn't really matter as much as this is talking about Rome. And the 10 kings, one of my theories is that it could be the main 7, including the 3 that were a part of the year of 4 emperors that weren't around very long, just a few months. Because of what it says in this chapter, I think it's something a little different. It's talking about the client kings that helped out. So in all of those Roman provinces, each province, like in Judea, they had King Herod, those client kings that were a part of the empire. And it says, and the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. There's a little bit of that. Not only talking about a woman, but talking about the beauty of the temple in Jerusalem. Having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her adultery. So follows this verse right here. Almost every word in this passage is a prophetic saying something. So the cup it's like a chalice of judgment or your fate. It's like your punishment. The chalice is a death sentence. She's holding in her hand the cup that she's going to drink, and that's going to be the end of her. And what's in that cup? Oh, it tells us in just a second. But it says it's full of the abominations. Abomination is a religious term. An abomination is like when the Romans rode their horses into the Holy of Holies and set up their ensigns. When Antiochus Epiphanes in the Greek apocalypse, the original Antichrist, went in and set up a statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies, that was an abomination. It's like the strongest form of blasphemy. You guys know the word abomination, right? What's stronger than an abomination? There's nothing. An abomination is like, all the language in this verse is like at an 11. You with me? You guys ever see this as Spinal Tap? One of the funniest movies. Nobody's seen Spinal Tap? All right, if you haven't seen it, it's a mockumentary. Meathead made it. He just passed away. And Rob Reiner. It was his first movie. Can't believe it was his first. But it's about a fictitious English rock and roll band. And Many musicians that saw it at the time, they didn't laugh, they cried because it was too close to home at how silly it made rock and roll musicians. But my favorite scene is he's showing the guy all his equipment. And he says, listen, this is my favorite amplifier. I had a special knob printed off for it that goes all the way up to 11. He goes, well, what's that for? He goes, well, just in case you need a little something extra, Most amps only go up to 10. This one goes up to 11. Rob Reiner says, well, couldn't you just make it go up to 10 and then make the amp louder? The guy says, yeah, but this one goes up to 11. That was the joke. Since then, you ask any musician, does your amp go up to 11? They know exactly what you mean. It's just that kind of, everything in this is at 11. It's over the top. Having in her hand the golden cup, the abominations. Listen, an abomination is it's a sacrilege. It's a complete desecration and of the filthiness of her adultery. Listen, he's not talking about actual adultery. He's talking about their spiritual adultery, right? The adultery of the nation and how filthy it was. And so, yeah, Charles.
Something maybe this is completely off the rail. When you were talking
Wait
about
till the
holding a
microphone
golden
gets
cup in her hand,
Holding the cup.
I thought that golden cup is the cup that Christ drank from at the Last Supper, and she's using it as a symbol of their disregard for their faith to Yahweh, and it's full of abomination and filthiness and adultery to Christ, or to God, because of their desecration of Jesus alone.
I don't think so, Charlie, but I'm going to think on that one. I'm going to think about it, okay? I'm going to get back to you. I don't know of a connection between this cup and the cup of communion or the cup of Christ. I don't know of a connection there, but I'm going to think more about it, okay? I've never seen that connection. I'm going to come back on it. Because the connection that I have is one that comes from the Old Testament. And so, I don't know, you can make a lot of connections. So this cup, earlier there were bowls of God's wrath poured out. The cup is the chalice of her punishment. And so, it is going to have blood in it. And Jesus' cup, okay, I'm going to get back to Charlie. Let me put a pause on that one and think about that one some more. But Jeremiah 51 says, Babylon has been a golden cup in Yahweh's hands, who made the land drunken. The nations have drunk her wine, therefore the nations are mad. So not only is the great prostitute, not only does she have the cup of her own doom, of her own punishment in her hand, but now she's making all the people of the land drink it too. So all those people that died in Jerusalem was because they drank the cup from the prostitute, right? You remember Jesus said, okay, so here's how he used it. Jesus did use on that night the symbol of a cup twice. One is, this cup is a new covenant. The other time he said, Lord, if at all possible, may this cup pass from me. So it's different than a covenant. This is a cup of poison. Like when they would, it's how Socrates died. They gave him hyssop in a cup and he drank it. Last words of Socrates, I drank what? Anyway. And that was it. Ezekiel 16:17 says, you also, your beautiful jewels of my gold and silver, which I had given you, all made for yourself images of men and played prostitute with them. This is Old Testament language, right? So John is using all this language of the pearls and the beautiful stones and playing prostitute. It's all talking about their idolatry in the Old Testament and the destruction of the first temple. And now John is reusing that. Jesus was walking along with some of his disciples, and they said, they were remarking how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. And so the beauty of Jerusalem, the beauty and the jewels and the stones, it's kind of also symbolic about the beauty of Jerusalem, this woman. And Jesus predicts that it's going to be destroyed. This is in the book of Luke. The book of Luke and Mark both talk in greater detail about the destruction of Jerusalem, because I think they were written after the destruction of Jerusalem. So when you read Matthew and Luke, unlike Mark, did I say Mark? Mark, I believe, was written before. It was looking and guessing that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, but Matthew and Luke know it's going to be destroyed. So in those passages where it talks about the Jews did this and then the Jews did this, it's a story written when they already knew that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. All right. Revelation 17, it says, and on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the land. And believe it or not, that's all one name. Those aren't several names, it's all one big long name. So in the ancient world, they had long names like that. And so you remember, his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace, Mighty God. That's all one name. That's not four different names. That's one big, long name. You'll see these on ancient inscriptions about their kings and stuff. So it's written in Greek in the New Testament. I've seen people go back and write this in what it would have been in Hebrew. I don't know, whatever it is. And by the way, the word mystery, it comes right before Babylon, and it's hard to tell whether that's part of the name or it's leading into the name. Neither one's incorrect. It's just a guess. It sounds more normal for mystery to be before it, not a part of the name. But Babylon the Great. We know what Babylon the Great is, the great city of the ancient world that tormented the Israelites, and then it got destroyed. How is Jerusalem Babylon the Great? Well, it can't be if you're in Jerusalem. Babylon the Great has to be another world power. But if you're living up in Asia Minor, like the audience was, just like Babylon was the city they escaped from, now Jerusalem is their Babylon, because the early church escaped from it and it got destroyed. You follow me on that? All right. The mother of prostitutes, just like all the Old Testament prophets, we're calling Jerusalem and Samaria prostitutes. It even uses that metaphor about the city of Tyre up on the north coast. And he says, you know what, there have been many prostitutes before me, but you're the mother of them all. Jerusalem was the mother of all prostitutes. Like Lucy says, of all the Charlie Browns in the world, you're the Charlie Browniest. You're the worst one ever. There's never been a more adulterous generation than the generation that got destroyed in Jerusalem. That's the message of this. Whether it's true or not, I wasn't there. I don't know. But anyway. And of the abominations of the land. Those are not different things. The abominations, by the way, have you noticed, instead of saying earth in every place, because many of the modern translators of the English Bible are futurists, and so they think this must be a prediction of the end times, and so it must apply to the whole earth. I really think that this prophecy in particular was really addressing the land of Israel. That's why Megiddo is a big deal, because it used to be in the land, all right? The abominations of the land. So the spiritual corruption of the land of Israel is the same thing as being the mother of prostitutes. You with me? So the prostitution it's talking about is religious prostitution. So good thing we don't have that anymore. Is there religious prostitution today? Are there times when we defraud the genuineness of Christianity? Are there people that do things in the name of Christianity that give it a bad name? Got any examples? What, everything you see on the evening news? People that make money by nefarious ways, people that make claims, and people that create violence and do things. You could say every one of those people are doing the same thing that what Jerusalem was judged by. So what's the reminder to you and us? Well, let's not be that one. Let's not ever let our pure and simple religion become prostituted out to something else, something it's not supposed to be. Let's keep it real. Let's keep it genuine. Let's keep it focused on Jesus. Anybody with me? Don't let it get into something that it's not supposed to be. That's what happened in every generation. And the Revelation is saying that's why Jerusalem got destroyed. But you be the church. You be the genuine version. You be the woman that got into the wilderness and that God protected. Don't be the woman riding on the beast. Yeah. And then he said, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And I wondered when I saw her great admiration. This is a difficult one. A lot of English things. I wondered when I saw her with great admiration. the reason he's wondered, he's perplexed at the fact that people love her so much. And he says, all this time, the Jerusalem power structure has been killing off the saints and killing off the martyrs, and yet people still think so highly of it. And so notice what's inside the cup that the woman is going to drink, and it's going to be the death of her. What's inside the cup is the blood of the saints. So this is her payback for killing Jesus, for killing James by tossing him from the temple, by killing Zechariah, by killing who else? What was one of the first martyrs? Remember Stephen? It says, and when the blood of Stephen, your martyr, the word is actually martyr in Greek, martyrios. Sometimes we translate that as witness. The word for witness means martyr. So you witness with your life. When his blood was shed, I was also standing by and consenting to his death and guarding the cloaks of those who killed him. That was the Apostle Paul's testimony. And so the message of the book of Revelation, whether I like it or you like it, is that the destruction of Jerusalem was because it was in Jerusalem where the blood of the saints was spilled. Now, somebody that's a futurist or that believes that this is Rome, here's one of those really strong points. But what about all those thousands of Christians that were killed in Rome under Nero and put into the... Yeah, you can make an argument just based on that it also could have been Rome. But for other reasons, I think it's not. But in this particular one, I can't really... You can see how people say, oh, that's talking about Rome. Especially in the first century. Christians weren't being killed in Jerusalem, they were being killed up in Rome. But this wasn't written about what happened afterwards. This was written about what had already happened in their life. And later on, it says literally, which is a verse that the Romanists cannot explain, they just breeze by it. It says, the city, the great city where their Lord was killed. Well, so that has to be Jerusalem, right? So anyway. Then the angel said to me, why do you wonder? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. What's the beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns? Is this on? It's Rome. All right? 7 heads. What has 7 heads? Rome. What has 10 horns? Rome. What is the roof? And the woman rides on the beast, which means Jerusalem is compromising with Rome, right? But the woman is not the beast. They're not the same thing, right? The woman is compromising and selling out to the paganism and the idolatry and the faithlessness of Rome. So the woman is the prostitute. The woman is Jerusalem who's sold out. That's what the mark of the beast was. It had to do with the money system, with the blasphemous names, deifying the Caesar and putting his name on a coin and saying this is the divine Augustus. It was a blasphemous thing. They said, we can't buy food without this stuff in our pockets. And he says, yeah, that's one of the reasons Jerusalem got destroyed. One of the reasons Jesus got so mad at the money changers. One of the reasons Jesus never had money in his pocket. It's all a part of the same prophecy. And so let me just talk about this. So here's a little Easter egg. I said that the prostitute is not a person, but there's a parallel. And this is out of the history books. You're going to hear it right here. You won't hear it in most writings about the book of Revelation. But something happened during the last part of this war between the queen of Judea and the general who was going to be the emperor. They had an affair. And so in the middle of this war, not only was the adulterous prostitute woman a metaphor for the selling out of Jerusalem, but it actually had a parallel in real life. And so she shows up in the book of Acts. It says this is when the Apostle Paul is on trial up at Caesarea Maritima, up on the coast, in this beautiful amphitheater that we'll go and visit when we ever go to Jerusalem. He says, and the next day, Agrippa, that's Agrippa II, and Berenice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. So Festus was the procurator that was in charge of the trial. So he was the Roman representative at this trial. And Agrippa was at this point the client king of Judea. under Rome. Judea was a Roman province. Agrippa II, his father Agrippa I, he inherited it from. This guy was raised in Rome, and then he was made the king of Judea. So who was, it says Berenice, it's actually pronounced Berenike. Last part of his name is like Nike in Greek. So who is Berenike? Is not his wife, it's his sister. I know, ew. It's super Games of Thrones. This is done in the ancient world. Part of her claim to fame, one, is that she really got around with a lot of different guys in history. And one of the great rumors about, and it's just a rumor, I wasn't there, is that sometimes you couldn't tell whether she was his sister or his wife. In the Bible, it talks about her like showing up like she's the queen, right? And then you read the history books and say, no, she wasn't his wife, she was his sister. And so not only did that happen, but Tacitus tells us something else. He's given us a little bit of the history of Titus, who was the general completing the last part of the war, and he's going to follow his father's footsteps and be the seventh emperor. But he's not yet, he's just a general. It says, these and the like thought that it made him, that's Titus, waver between hope and fear, but hope triumphed. Some suppose that he retraced his steps for the love of Queen Berenike, nor was his young heart adverse to her charms, but this affection occasioned no hindrance to action. They were having, could you imagine this? She's supposed to be the queen of Judea, but instead of defending them, not only did Agrippa not defend them, but he supplied soldiers to Vespasian. And then he supplied soldiers. Could you imagine if you lived in the city, how sold out you'd feel? Talk about a city becoming a prostitute, right? She actually followed him. I thought he left her in Jerusalem. Actually, I read a little bit more. She actually, at some point in 75, followed him to Rome, but then all the courtiers and people started making fun of him, so he sent her back. He couldn't handle the pressure, and then a couple of years later, he died. But isn't that something? All right, let me just get back. I said that the harlot of Babylon was not an actual person, but it actually had a historical parallel to it. You know, in this way, in so many different ways, can you start to see how the people of Jerusalem felt sold out and felt like, man, we really was, that city really was like the harlot of Babylon. So many different ways. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to come up out of the abyss. I don't know what that phrase means. My guess, and this would be like a 10% guess, is that maybe it's alluding to the fact that Vespasian did the first part of the war, and then there was a huge halftime where they all went down to Egypt, and then Vespasian went up to Rome and became emperor, and then Titus came back and finished it off. So maybe this is talking about the fact that they were here and then they left and they came back again. 10%. I have different percentages I put on all these theories. That, by the way, even though it's maybe the least popular, that Babylon is Jerusalem, I'm about 98% personally. I'm so convinced, but yeah, I'm never 100%. And he comes up out of the abyss. Remember the abyss where the angel of the abyss comes out, and its name was Apollyon. The king over them was Apollyon, which is a play on words. Apollyon comes from the word apolleia, which means destruction, but it also just happened to be that the 10th legion that Vespasian led, on its banner, it said Legio 10, Legion 10, Apollonarius. So it's a play on words, that they go into destruction, but it also has to do with Apollo's name. And those that dwell on the land and whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. So that differentiates those that stayed in Jerusalem with those that got out, those that are now the early church, because their names are written in the book of life. So those that stayed in the city and whose names will marvel when they see that the beast was and is not and shall be present. Here is the mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. Now here's one of those places that gets really, it's so ambiguous. For those of us that are in the 95% that say that the harlot is Rome, it's because the city of the 7 hills is a very well-known reference to Rome. Rome is the city on the 7 hills. If you go visit there, they'll take you on a tour of 5 of them. They had 5 different hills, and each one had like a name, and they had spiritual significance. And so, but notice what it says, is it's not saying the woman is the city of 7 hills. It says that the 7 heads belong to Rome, right? Which are, that has two meanings. One of them is that it's 7 hills, that's Rome. And it's not the woman, she's not the same thing, but she's the one sitting on the beast. Are you with me? So it's not saying the woman is the 7 heads with the 7 hills. It's saying that Rome is, and she is sitting on Rome. You with me? That's my explanation. That's my way around that. Okay, Propertius, say it. He says the lofty city of 7 hills, which rules the whole world. I even have a map of them. You can go there. I can't read any of those. Can you? Aventius, anyway. You go look them up. All you got to do is type into Wikipedia, city of 7 hills, and you'll have more information than you ever wanted to have about that. But Jerusalem was never called the city of 7 hills, although some have tried to make the argument that there were hills all around there that could have been the city of 7. I don't think that's the case. So I still think Babylon and the harlot is Jerusalem, but that phrase is just talking about her relationship with Rome, right? Not saying that she is Rome. And then so not only are the 7 heads 7 hills, but they're also 7 kings. So in an apocalypse, one symbol can mean 2 different things or 3 different things. So this is where it gets complicated with all the charts people draw about it. It's just because it uses it a different way doesn't mean it's something different. And so there are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. When he comes, he must continue a little while. What are they? Do you remember your emperors? All right. Here's my Cook's best guess. Would I die for this theory? No. How sure am I that these are the 7? 30. I give it a 30%. I don't know who else it would be, but it's pretty good because it goes Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius. It says 5 that have fallen. What did it say in the prophecy? 5 have fallen, the 1 is, and the other is not yet come, right? So Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero are now dead. 1 is, that's Vespasian, and 1 who's going to come, because Titus isn't yet an emperor, but he was going to be by the time of the writing of Revelation. Well, what about Domitian? So he's the one that comes after him, Titus's brother, who may or may not have had something to do with his death, but made up for it by building monuments to his brother and deifying him, calling him a god. But, well, why don't they include him? I think they do in this one. The beast that was and is not, and is himself also an 8th, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. Okay. So there's an 8th. So that could be Domitian. All right. Or some of the church fathers started with Nero, and then they included the 3 interim ones that I don't count. And so then there's 4, and then this is 5, and then this is 6, and then Domitian is 7. Does it matter? No, not to me. This is my best guess. I don't know of a better guess than this, but in general, it's Rome. It doesn't specifically matter to me which head is which. Yes, Malcolm.
So was that written after?
Sorry, go ahead.
So was that written after number 8 there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we think, well, yes. I forgot who it was. Who was the church father? Ignatius. Ignatius of Lyon says that Revelation was written about the end of Domitian's reign. And he was just a few years later. So we think somewhere in Domitian's reign, somewhere around 95. We don't have an exact date, but yeah. So that's why a lot of people want to count all the way to Domitian. But I think time machine-wise, I think the book of Revelation, even though it was written in 95, it's writing from the perspective of during the war. So it would have made Titus the 7th one. All right. There we go. There's a possible theory. I wouldn't base everything just on which film, but it's really obvious to me that the 7 heads and the 10 horns are Rome. The 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom of as yet. They received authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one mind, and they give their power and authority to the beast. Okay, so now we have for the first time, we have what the 10 horns are. Why are there 7 heads and 10 horns? It doesn't quite make sense. He says the 10 horns are 10 kings that give their authority to the beast, who's Rome. So this is what an empire is that each one of those client states had their own king, and the emperor is the king of the kings. That's how an empire works. So the king of Judea was Agrippa II and his sister wife, Berenike. Anyway, and there were different ones. So Josephus tells us that when Vespasian, his father, attacked the north, so this isn't about the present, he doesn't list 10, he lists 4. But here's the idea of the relationship between these kings. He says there were also a considerable number of auxiliaries got together. So he calls them auxiliary kings that came from the kings Antiochus, he was the king of Commagene, and Agrippa of Judea, Sohemus of Syria, each of them contributing 1,000 footmen that were archers and 1,000 horsemen. Malchus also, the king of Arabia, sent 1,000 horsemen beside 5,000 footmen, the greatest part of which were archers. So that was in the first stage of the war. During the second stage, we don't have such a listing. But from all over, if you remember my big map, the Roman Empire looked like this. So Judea was one of the kingdoms, Napatia, here's Syria, here's Commagene. So when these Roman legions marched from Egypt and marched from Europe down there to come to that place, they would pick up conscripts from all of these regions. And each one of these kings, just like in World War II, every state sent somebody. And so my best guess, and this is just the best, is that those 10 horns he's talking about are just client kings. And we just don't have a list of which 10 he's talking about. But for him, there were at least 10 different kings that pitched in on the second stage. Josephus does tell us that the second army was bigger than the first army. And then he says, these will war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. So at some point, on their way down, they're persecuting the early church as well. For he is what? The King of kings and the Lord of lords. And they will overcome him, with him, those who are called chosen and faithful. The word Lord is Kyrios, where we got the great 80s song, Kyrie eleison, Lord, be with me. Kyrios is one of the titles of the emperor. So to say Jesus is Lord for us is just a religious statement. Back in those days, it was subversion. It was saying the emperor is not Lord, Jesus is emperor. Jesus is Lord. He's the emperor of emperors, and he's the king of kings. And so he's over all of them. And so the 10 horns, once again, it's just a symbolic thing. All of it keeps pointing back to, he's just talking about the Roman army that came and destroyed Jerusalem. And, as many of the Old Testament prophets do, at the point that it's a righteous judgment on somebody, even those foreign kings are used as a tool of the Lord. So even though the Romans were the bad guys in this story, at this point, because it was the will of God that Jerusalem fall, they're kind of instruments being used by him. Questions? Kevin.
So didn't you at one time tell us that there was like 3 kings that were just like boom, boom, boom at the end there? And so that's why they became 7 and 10?
Yeah.
There was just like small...
Yeah, the year of the 4 emperors.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those are the ones on the list I mentioned after Rome. So either those are counted or they're not counted. So, and it just depends. And even the church fathers, Kevin, they had their theories about which emperors they were talking about, and they didn't all agree. So it doesn't matter to me to get the list down, but you could either count those 3 that were just emperors for like several months or not count them because they weren't significant. You can put the microphone on, I can't hear it. What? What?
That's why there's more horns than heads or whatever.
Yeah, that's one of my theories. I think because of this chapter, my leading theory would be that the reason there's a different number of horns and heads is because the horns are referring to Roman emperors. The heads are Roman emperors, the 7 heads, and the 10 horns are client kings. They're subservient client kings. They are just different local kings that helped out. He says, because they gave all their authority to the beast. So they were underlings, they were subservient, and it says, and they reigned with him for 1 hour. So it was just temporary. That makes more sense to me than the 4 emperors. Any other questions? Oh, it says, and he said to me, the waters which you saw, so remember the prostitute sits on many waters. The waters are where the prostitute sits are the peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. And so you think of this coalition of the Roman army being the people from all over the Roman Empire. Every language, every tribe. And basically Jerusalem had sold herself out to all of these client kings. There's stories too about Herod Agrippa when he built Caesarea, which is where we'll stand. He used it as a place it was his own private Mar-a-Lago. He would have those kings from those different regions come and visit and stay up on the Sea of Galilee at Caesarea. So that idea of, Jerusalem kind of giving up its sovereignty and prostituting out and giving all its authority away to Rome, that was kind of the condition of that generation. The 10 horns which you saw, the beast. Okay, now here's the part. All right. If I'm wrong, explain this next part. Because the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, these will hate the prostitute and they will make her desolate. They will make her naked and they will eat her flesh and they will burn her utterly with fire. So if the prostitute's Rome and the beast is Rome, how come the beast destroy the beast? Doesn't make sense, right? This makes absolute sense if you've been following me all night. Because the beast, right, is Rome, and all of the client kings, even though they had trade agreements with Jerusalem, at some point it just got so bad where they all turned on her and just burnt her to the ground. I mean, so this is literally burnt her. That word, by the way, desolate, eremos, is a very prophetic word by what happens to a city when it gets destroyed. Desolate. It's very Old Testament. Jesus uses it. So, make her naked, eat her flesh, and burn her utterly with fire, which is what happened to Jerusalem. And so, when did this happen to Rome? Not at least until 400 AD. So I don't think it can talk about Rome. And plus, how does it make sense? It only makes sense if the beast and the 10 horns and the beast turn on the prostitute. That's about Rome and the client kings destroying Jerusalem. Yeah? Anybody think it doesn't make sense? Am I wrong? Once you see it, it's hard to unsee it, don't you think? Ezekiel 23 says, and they will deal with you, Jerusalem, in hatred and take away everything you have worked for. They will leave you stark naked, and the shame of your prostitution will be exposed. John is using old Ezekiel language about the first destruction of Jerusalem, including the idea that this prostitute, he gets more graphic in 23, I won't even read it, cutting off body parts, and he takes the metaphor way too far. Some church fathers thought Ezekiel should be edited or taken out, because it just really, it takes that idea of Jerusalem being a prostitute and it gets way too graphic. You know how we always tell our kids to read their Bible? I've second guessed that. I want to be more narrow. Read parts of the Bible. Daddy, what's a prostitute? Never mind, son. Go back and play with your Legos. Jesus said, do you remember? Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to her. How often I would have gathered your children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. That's just so heartbreaking to me. But Jesus was prophesying about this is what's going to happen. And I've called you. Who got destroyed in that generation? Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. For God put it in his hearts to do what he had in mind and to be of one mind and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God should be accomplished. And the woman who you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the land. This last verse doesn't make sense if you say kings of the earth. Say, when was Jerusalem ever the prominent city that ruled over the whole earth? It has to be Rome. Then you remember the word earth can also be translated land, and that for a long time Jerusalem was the prominent city in that entire region, including places like Nabatea and Syria and stuff like that. She was the prominent city. So it said this great city used to rule over the kings of the land, but now the kings of the land had turned on her and destroyed her. Any questions? So what's the moral of tonight? Don't sell out. We got to keep our religion pure, right? Keep it about the main things. Keep it about grace and love, and not let it be taken over by agendas. Friends, I got to tell you, there are times that agendas try to take over the church. It's one of the hardest things when somebody very passionate comes in and they want me to preach. Oh man, there are people that really get mad at me for not being political enough. And almost always, if they were to know what my political stance really was on what that was, they would not want me to be more political. Let's say, okay, be less political then. Say, all right. Yeah, you want me to be more political? Yeah, which one? You want me to be a hyper liberal from the pulpit? You want me to be super hyper conservative from the pulpit? Or do you want me to just let you make up your own mind? That's how I approach it. I have my own opinions, but there are things that can creep into the church that if we're not careful, it gets taken in the wrong direction. But yeah, we are the faithful bride. We're the bride of Christ. We just need to be faithful to him and him alone. Amen? He's going to come for us. It's not going to be, we don't want him to come and say, listen, why are you running after all of those other things? I just want to be faithful to him. That's it. I want to be faithful to him. That's what the early church heard. The reason Jerusalem got burned to the ground is because Jerusalem stopped being faithful to her husband. Started running around like a prostitute. And that's not us. By the way, that's not about a woman. It's about all of us. All right. Yeah? Would you pray with me and then take as much time as you want, talk about it. You want to find somebody next to you and say, what did this mean to me tonight? But Lord, I just thank you tonight. I just want to be faithful to you. I thank you, Lord, that you love us, that you got a plan for us. And I thank you, Lord, that you just give us opportunities like this just to get into your word and find out more about what it is that you're trying to say to us. We give you the praise, Lord Jesus. In your name, amen, amen. Lord bless you. Have a great night. Thanks for coming.